You're watching the YouTube version of the We Are Innovation podcast. Join us as we explore how innovation, new technologies, and human creativity improve our lives. The future is calling.
Hi, I'm Federico Fernández. Welcome to a new episode of the We Are Innovation podcast. Today, we are going to talk about a realistic approach towards green transition, a path that meets the needs of developing countries in particular. And for that, I am accompanied by Robert Atkinson. Robert is the founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF, which is recognized as the world's top think tank for science and technology policy. He leads a prolific team of policy analysts and fellows that is successfully shaping the debate and setting the agenda on a host of critical issues at the intersection of technological innovation and public policy. He's an internationally recognized scholar and widely published author whom the New Republic has named one of the three most important thinkers about innovation. Washington Magazine has called a tech titan. Government Technology Magazine has judged to be one of the 25 top doers, dreamers, and drivers of information technology, and the Wharton Business School has given the Wharton Infosys Business Transformation Award. Online, you can find him on the ITIF website. I'm going to leave the link on the description of the episode. Robert, welcome to the We Are Innovation podcast.
Hey, thank you so much, Federico. My pleasure.
Thank you very much. We're very happy to have you. And as I introduced, we want to talk about green transition. And you've recently, you and two of your colleagues have written, and I'll link to the full document as well, which is hosted on the ITIF website. But my first question has to do with why did you and your co-authors write Beyond Force, a realist pathway through the green transition?
We wrote it because we believe that climate change is a pretty critical problem and we need a solution that scales globally, and that the conventional wisdom, both domestically and around the world, is frankly not going to get us there. The conventional wisdom, which frankly almost everybody has bought into, including the various COPs meeting and it's that, number one, we have all the technology we need right now to solve climate, which is false. Number two, countries can and should do this by taking action in their own country. And that ultimately countries, individuals, companies should, as we say, wear the hair shirt of climate policy. In other words, pay more, suffer, stop flying, don't eat meat. It's okay to pay more for your electricity. Those are all well and good if you're living in a rich country and you happen to be in the upper quartile of income. You can afford to do these kinds of things. I get all my electricity at my home from a renewable source, just because I'm committed to climate, but I pay more for that. And only 2% of Americans are willing to do that. So our whole point was, the idea of sort of forcing lower quality, higher price energy, clean energy on the world will not work. And it won't even work in the United States and Europe. I mean, you had the orange vest movement or whatever it was in France against higher gas prices. It certainly won't work in India, Africa, places like that. They will not pay a premium for energy, nor should they, frankly. Their needs are so great just for things like food and healthcare and education. So in other words, climate has to shift. Climate policy has to shift towards how do we get the real cost, not the subsidized price, but the real cost of clean technologies down at least to where dirty technologies are. If we don't do that, we're never going to solve the problem.
You mentioned in your article that this is a global problem and it needs to have a global solution. And you were mentioning, and I come from Argentina, which is a country experiencing a lot of economic problems, and also sometimes demonized, in Europe because of agricultural production. But that's for another discussion. But in any case, you gave us some hints, but you go to in depth regarding this issue. What can we do in order to ensure, let's say, green solutions that are equitably distributed and have and keep in mind, consider the diverse needs of diverse nations? Because, as you said, not all of us live in fully developed, rich countries that, let's say, have different kinds of problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So if you look at what the United States has done recently, Congress passed a law called the Inflation Reduction Act. Really what it was a massive tax incentive program for clean energy. So you now have, boy, oh boy, a whole lot of companies are from around the world building battery plants in the US, building electric vehicle plants in the US. And everybody's like, oh, this is great. The US now is going to significantly decarbonize. Yeah, it's great, but at one level, so what? We could go to zero in the US and global emissions would still grow after about another 10 years. They'd be back up and be growing. So it doesn't really matter what any individual country does. What matters is, are we collectively working to develop solutions that are scalable globally by people, companies, governments that want to use them? So I bought a new laptop a while ago, not because the government gave me an incentive to buy a laptop or I had laptop guilt. I bought a laptop because it was so much better and did more because of Moore's law. The price goes down and the quality goes up. That's why people buy these things. And then, what you're hearing now is, well, we need the just transition. And what they mean by that is, well, we're going to force developing countries to adopt this stuff that they wouldn't do anyway, but we'll give them a bunch of money. Well, first of all, we're not going to give them a bunch of money. Let's be honest. There's not enough money to do. We just don't have enough money to pay for the transition in developing or emerging markets. We're talking 30, 40, 50 trillion dollars. Where's that going to come from? So there'll be like symbolic things. Well, we'll do this fund for $300 million or whatever. And again, it doesn't do anything. What I would think we should all be doing, and there's certainly no reason why countries like Argentina or India or other countries can't also contribute to innovation. Argentina has an innovation system, but we should all be working on, can we innovate and develop technologies that other people want to adopt? Like, for example, if we could develop a battery that was 3 times more energy density and half the price, wow, now we're talking. Or if we could develop all sorts of solar energy systems that are 5 times better, and that's when Argentina will want to adopt that. You'll have utilities there that say, hey, we want to adopt that because it's going to be 35-40% cheaper than a coal-fired power plant. So that's what we have to really change our thinking. One of the things that we proposed ITIF a number of years ago, perhaps a decade ago, we said that when the countries all meet together at whatever COP it was, a climate conference, that in addition to saying, hey, we're going to cut emissions, which at the end of the day, I could say I'm going to cut drinking and go on a diet every New Year's, but most people don't. They keep drinking and they don't lose weight, but sounds good to say that stuff. Why don't you commit to doubling your clean energy R&D? So there are about 20 countries. They committed to doing that. We have a new report at ITIF coming out soon, and only one country did that, and that was the UK. Most countries, when you compare it as a per share of GDP, a whole bunch of countries actually cut their R&D, clean energy R&D, their innovation, their R&D into solar, into batteries, into clean steel. They cut it. So tell me why we should take these countries' claims seriously when they won't even put money, and we're not talking an enormous amount of money, they won't even put money behind the science and the research and the engineering to develop really innovative solutions. So I think until we do that, it's going to really be hard to address and solve climate change as we need to do.
What about the other part of the equation of what you and your colleagues on the paper called the School of Force, if I remember correctly, which is regulations and international regulations and things like that. Do you think that this part of let's say the force approach to the issue, where do you see it going? Do you think it could go too far? In a way, and sorry for using this word that sometimes has been overused, but sometimes some of these issues seem to be tackled in a very imperialistic way, particularly in rich countries telling the developing world what they should do, which is basically not to do anything of what of what they've done in order to become rich and successful. So how do you see this part of let's impose global regulations, let's put, I don't know, the UN in charge of green energy or things like that?
Well, first, I was on a panel a number of years ago. It was a panel about climate and energy and unions and good jobs and all that. And there was in my remarks, I said, it is morally incorrect to try to save the climate by keeping less developed or lower income countries from getting rich. It's immoral to do that. And I highlighted India. I had just been to India, and it's an incredibly high levels of poverty, as we all know. I don't want India to live like that. I want India to live like Americans, in the sense of having a high standard of living, a middle-class standard of living. And a person on the panel said, no, the climate cannot afford to have Indians be middle class. And I was appalled. And I said, well, if you think that, then you should donate all your money. And have you cut your spending? You're a professor, you probably make 100,000 easily. Are you like giving half of your salary back to live simply? And yeah, of course they're not. So I think it's the height of actually immorality. I would call it immorality to say that emerging markets, emerging countries should not get as rich as possible, as quickly as possible. It's appalling to me that we are there, America's there, Japan is there. So I think that's awful. And more importantly, not needed. And secondly, we can say that. Anybody really think that if we say that, we're going to keep countries poor? Countries have most countries, unless they're communist or something, have a strong desire to raise their living standards. So even if we wanted to believe we could do it, we can't do it. We shouldn't do it. What we should say is, and if you think about what climate emissions are, there's an equation, which is population times per capita income times a cleanliness coefficient. So the more people you have, the more emissions you have. The more money you have, the more emissions you have. But if you can get that coefficient down through clean energy, through better technology, then the entire world can. We should be thinking about a world wherein, by 2050, world GDP is twice as large as it is today. I think that'd be a great world. I want to live in that world. But we could also have it be a world where emissions are slashed by 75%. If we invest and focus on innovation. Now, the point about what I should clarify what we've said about regulation, about subsidies, it's not that we're opposed to those. It's that certain technology, the real core of our argument is that the technologies go through what we're called S curve. So at the beginning of any technology, they're very high priced and they don't work all that well. And you have these lead adopters who buy them, and eventually, because of scale and learning in the production system, these get cheaper and they get better. The real question is, are certain technologies we have today, is that S curve going to go down below the cost of dirty energy, or is it going to stabilize? So if you look at green hydrogen, for example, it doesn't look like green hydrogen will ever get there. It just doesn't. It's always going to be more expensive. But certain you could imagine, for example, putting making the grid green, you could imagine a new technology. So our whole point about subsidies is it's okay to subsidize a technology where you think there's a real chance that as scale goes up, cost goes really, really far down. That's okay to use subsidies because by then the new technology is so cheap that a country like India or Argentina or Nigeria or whatever country it might be, they can afford it and they'd want to buy it. So it's not like we're saying regulation or subsidies have no role. It's that they should be used in the purpose of driving down costs and boosting innovation and quality.
It seemed to me that, let's say, it's key to your approach, what you've labeled the P3, the price performance parity. Can you give us a deeper insight in what you mean, and do you think are we close in the case of any clean energy, we're close to this P3 model or idea?
Yeah, so we're certainly closer on some than we are on others. Green aviation fuel, we're not close. It doesn't appear we're anywhere near close. So the question, for example, on aviation is, are countries willing to impose a mandate for clean aviation fuel? And if so, are customers going to be, are they going to revolt? Are they going to vote people out of office? Are countries that don't want to do that? Like why should Latin American airlines that fly between each other's country, why should they pay more for clean fuel? Now, maybe if they fly into the US, we could have a mandate that says any plane that flies into the US has to be using clean fuel. There are other technologies where a lot of people say, a lot of the experts say, oh yeah, we're already at price performance parity. So President Biden, about a year and a half ago, he announced in a statement saying that we already have all the technologies we need to solve climate, and we can do it without an increase in price. So we looked at that, and then we looked at a number of studies that the president's advisors cited, and every single one, more or less, had two features in them. One was the technologies are already cheap enough, assuming you continue to subsidize them. Well, then they're not cheap. They're cheap in price. They're not cheap in cost because the price is low because you're subsidizing them. And secondly, and this was even more hilarious, these technologies are price competitive as long as we assume the price will fall by half. Well, maybe so. The price has been falling on a lot of these. Maybe it'll fall by half. I hope so, but maybe it won't. Maybe instead of that, it goes like that. So a lot of people now say, well, solar is price competitive with fossil in the US. And it is in certain areas of the country, and it is certain sort of times of the day. But that's not really the right question. The right question is, it doesn't really, again, so we have solar produce 30% of electricity in the world. What about the other 70%? What happens on the days when it's really cloudy? When there's no wind, no solar? What happens on the days when there's no wind? You have to build in a massive new electric grid, and you have to build in storage. Now that costs money. And so when people say solar and wind are price competitive, they're not really price competitive when you say, I want 95% renewables in the grid. It's not price competitive now because long duration storage costs a lot of money. Rebuilding the grid so that you can have solar over here and the users way 1,000 miles away costs a lot of money. So I think we've deluded ourselves into thinking these technologies are really good. There's a recent article in one paper about people who are renting cars in the US, and they happen to get an electric vehicle. And they're like, I want an electric vehicle, but they get stuck with an electric vehicle. And they're like, one lady was talking about how she had to drive like 130 miles. The car was fully charged. She got 80 miles and it was running they had no electricity anymore. Look, for a lot of people, electric vehicles will be fine. If I drove a lot, I'd get one. I ride my bike to work, so I don't need an electric vehicle. Let's just assume hypothetically I did, and my wife has a car too, so we have two cars. I hardly ever drive mine, but so it makes no economic sense for me to get an electric vehicle because the payback is because you save money on the gas. but let's say it made economic sense. I would, at least I'm saying myself, and I think most Americans wouldn't get an electric vehicle for their main vehicle. I'd get one to commute to work. So, because I know I can get home, I can drive to work, get home. It's 25 miles round trip, and I can just charge it, and that's fine. So I don't think we're there yet with cost and performance, and we might be getting there. But you look at, for example, some of the really, really, cutting edge research on new battery technology. It's like pretty wild. That's where I want to put my money. I want to put my money into really cool breakthrough things where 1,000 miles on a charge. Like, wow, okay, now we don't have any more range anxiety. And by the way, the price is really, really low, so I don't need a subsidy to make an electric vehicle cheaper than a gas car. That's when we would really start to make progress.
On your paper, what you make quite clear is that you think a big part of the solution in order to reach into transition to green energy is based upon let the market work and let innovation work. What can you tell us about that?
So yeah, so it's a little bit of a nuanced point. Essentially, what we're saying is we need government and the private sector and entrepreneurs and researchers to play a big role early on in the process to get this technology so the market will adopt it. But at the end of the day, this transition is so big. Individuals have to change things in their homes and how they, what they buy in terms of vehicles and other things like that. Companies have to change, et cetera. Only market forces are big enough to do that kind of investment. There's no way the government can pay for this. So basically what you want to do is you want to, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make him drink unless the water tastes really good. That's the role of government here, is to make the water taste good, to make people want to buy. I wouldn't buy an internal combustion engine. Are you kidding me, man? The performance is terrible and I pay extra. I want an electric vehicle. That's where the market forces come in, or where individual big manufacturers say, you know what, I want to redo my my coal-based furnaces because I can save 8% on my cost if I switch over to this cleaner thing. That's what we talk about in terms of market forces. There's a lot of incentives if you can build the technology the right way. There's a lot of incentives to do that. One of the things that most of the climate groups now say, and I know why they say it, but I have to say it kind of irritates me that they say it because it's false. They say, hey, you can do this and save money now. No, you can't. There may be a few cases here and there, sure. And they say that because they understand that there's no way the government can pay for all this. So if you lead this narrative and saying, hey, if you do this, even though it's going to cost you money, you'll end up saving money, then it makes it easier for people to think, hey, this isn't a hair shirt I've got to wear. This is something cool I really want to do. I wish we were there. I don't think we are there. And saying that we're there, pretending that we're there is really making the problem harder, not easier.
And related to what you've just said, what do you think should be the role of climate activists? Because I mean, let's say it's become it's a force in our society. In many European countries, for instance, I'm sure that in a big way, for instance, GMOs are forbidden because of the kind of cultural climate that activists have created. So, I mean, I would regard that as a very negative outcome of what they are doing. But how do you envision their role in our societies?
Well, look, at the end of the day, most of what they're doing is a dead end. I got into a debate. The climate activist in the UK was saying, it was terrible that British Petroleum, I think it was British Petroleum, was sponsoring the British bike team in the Tour de France or whatever. And I was like, so are you telling me you don't consume any oil in any of the products you buy? You don't take the bus, you don't have a laptop with there's plastics in it, like it's just to me, it's very well. Let me put it. What they're really pushing for is, well, what if we don't drill for as much oil? First of all, you really think that's going to happen? because oil is fungible. If you don't drill for it in the North Sea or whatever, somebody else will drill it. There's no question about that. The amount of drilling is set by supply and demand, and the supply is going to be, there's lots of supply in other places. So the idea of doing these kinds of things, or like, oh, we're going to block the freeways, like it's a meaningless gesture. And it's even worse, it really alienates, it pisses people off. If this is what climate is, screw you. Screw you, I'm not doing this. And that's not the message we want to send, these idiots going up there and throwing stuff on the pool tables or whatever, whatever climate action people. I think they're really, really doing a lot of harm. What they should be doing instead is they should be saying, hey, where is our clean energy innovation policy? If they want to demonstrate outside of their parliament and say, I want to see a 50% increase in the budget this year for clean energy engineering, research, science, et cetera. That's what they should be doing. But it's much, much more fun to, to say just silly things like, well, if we block this pipeline, you do know that oil is not based on supply, it's based on demand. So the only way to stop people consuming oil, producing oil, is to stop consuming oil. And we're not going to stop consuming oil until people have some alternatives. I mean, it's just never going to happen. And even if you could sort of get the activists to be successful in a place like Europe, which, by the way, they will not be, let's assume they were successful. Again, so what? European emissions could go to zero. Which won't happen, but let's assume it did because of these, hardcore activists, some of them who are actually violent. Let's assume it did. Really, are you telling me that Latin America is not going to want to grow their economies and going to continue to burn oil? India, China, come on. So I think it's sort of feel-good symbolism, that Greta Lundberg, she's like says, you've betrayed the younger generation. It's like, what were we supposed to do? What were we supposed to do? We're going to tell working class people in Sweden that they should pay a whole lot more? Really? That's what you're calling for? And I would say to Greta's family or her, when you stop driving cars, maybe we can talk. When you stop flying in airplanes, maybe we can talk. The reality is we are a fossil fuel-based world, and we should transition out of that. Don't get me wrong, but sort of, blaming people, screaming at people, protesting, it's just performance art.
Without going into any denialism or anything like that, but I have had in the past conversations about these topics, and I really like to know how the experts see this particular issue. How existential do you think the problem with climate is right now? Because I mean, we literally hear people who say that, I don't know, in 10 years, the world will be uninhabitable. People, of course, who say that there's no problem at all, and, whatever you can find in between. What's your, and again, this is not, to deny that there's an issue or, there are some things that we could do better, but let's say, what kind of existential problem is that? Because, for instance, hunger in many parts of the world is definitely an existential problem for a lot of people, for children. So where would we put this issue in that context?
So, with the caveat being, I try to limit what we talk about at ITIF to things we've actually studied, and we're not climatologists, and so nor have I reviewed the literature. What I do know is that climate change is a problem. I think everybody can agree on that. And what I do know is we're not going to solve it unless we get more innovation. And so our focus is let's get more innovation. I'm in the middle somewhere. You've heard these end of the world in 3 years kind of. It's like, you'd see these people in the U.S. These hardcore Christian fundamentalists who would say, repent now because the end, the rapture is coming in 3 years and we're all going to go to heaven or hell. Yeah, that didn't happen. So you have some of that with climate where people are like, yeah, like 10, 20 years ago, people were saying we only have 5 years left. Now we only have another 5 years. Yeah, I'm skeptical of that. But I'm also not of the view that I do think this is man-made. There are some on the right who say, the right now finally acknowledges maybe that there's global warming, but they kind of a lot of them say, well, it's not man-made. I'm happy to believe it's man-made. That seems like what the science shows. Happy to believe it's going to impose costs, maybe big costs, but I don't see it as we're all going to die. I just don't see that happening. But it's possible, I don't say it, it's possible that you will have significant agricultural problems. But I don't think those aren't going to, at the end of the day, those aren't going to affect rich countries because food is a commodity and the price of food will go way up and America we'll all pay more for food, but we'll get our food. It's more about poor people who won't be able to afford food. I think that's a possibility. Which, by the way, is one of my colleague Val Giddings, we wrote a report for us on the importance of GMO for addressing climate change, not just on bioengineered energy, but on crops. With heat and drought resistance, if we don't really start, ramping up and improving GMO-based crops, there are going to be people who are going to starve because we need an adaptive agricultural system. And, you get these climate activists who say no GMOs and stop burning oil. And, so I think, I'm kind of, at one level, I don't think about that question. All I think about is how do we get more innovation in it? I think what I like about that approach is I think everybody should be able to agree with that. Even conservatives who are a little skeptical of climate, like, hey, what if we built an energy system that was 25% cheaper and clean? Well, that's cool. We'd all be better off. Let's try that. Let's shoot for that. So,
how do you see us getting there, and how would you like the 2050 to look like? How do we get innovation solving our problems, and how should the future look like? A greener future, a better future? How do you see that?
So the 2050 guideline, everybody I think makes a fetish out of it. It's like, yeah, it's nice, but explain to me in 2048 when we're not there, what are you going to do? Like really? What are you going to do? You're going to somehow stop this? Like, no, you can't do that. I think rather than focus on goals, like end goals, like by 2050, I think what we should do is focus more on processes and say, by 2030, we're going to triple the amount of clean energy R&D around the world. And every country, with the exception of the really, really impoverished countries, but every country, Argentina including, should play a role in that. Their engineers and scientists should be doing something in this. I think that's what we should be doing, but nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking about that. And rather than say, well, we have this hard and fixed goal. I mean, the thing about innovation in science is you can't really set goals. I mean, we had the Manhattan Project to create an atomic bomb. Well, okay. We can have aspirations, we can have directions, but you can't just magically wave a wand and say, okay, I've just invented this thing that's going to be half the price of oil. I think what we should instead do is, as a world, say, look, we are fully committed to solving this problem in a way that people are going to want to use this stuff. They're going to want to buy this clean energy and products. And we're going to innovate to get there. And the way to do that is we got to put a little bit of money of our societal resources behind that. And everybody could put 2% of GDP, or sorry, not even 2% of GDP, 0.2% of GDP. And you would make an enormous amount of progress, but we're not doing that.
You gave us some hints during our conversation, but I would like to have your answer regarding what should be the role of governments, particularly because, as you know, when there's an issue or a perceived issue or whatever, there's a do something mentality. The government must do something, and then, they come up with big plans and great ideas or not so great, but at least that on paper sound and deadlines, like 2050 or 2030 or whatever, or tomorrow. So what should be, according to you, what should be the approach of the government if they want to play a role in solving this issue?
Well, I think there's only the government ultimately can solve this. There's very little, I shouldn't say little, there's not all that much incentive for private companies to want to do this because unlike other products, energy is a commodity. It's like, man, this connection's working great, man, because the electrons on this that are crossing, these are wind electrons. Those wind electrons are so much better than oil-generated electrons. So it's just a commodity. So the market forces for innovation are just way lower. Nobody cares how you got your electrons. They care about what you can do with them. So I think the role of government, to me, would be every government should assess where it's spending, whether it's direct spending or regulatory or tax incentives for things, and say, you know what, probably 80% of that's not really driving innovation. It's just subsidizing a bunch of wind turbines. I would say, you know what, we're going to really, really go back and we're going to think about how our entire system works in terms of entrepreneurship and energy innovation. So in the US, for example, our federal laboratories, our Department of Energy laboratories, reality is they don't do that great a job on commercializing innovation. They do an okay job. Some of them are better than others. So we should do that. We could have, for example, one of the things that we were able to get done a few years ago in Congress was a clean energy R&D tax credit. We could expand that. If you're a company and you're doing clean energy R&D, you get a more generous tax credit. We could identify and create clean energy innovation centers at our universities. Like, okay, I'm just making this up, big university in Buenos Aires, and its focus happens to be on some kind of materials that are really fine. We're going to double your funding in 5 years. You ramp up, you really build capabilities there. So there's lots of things. We could be training more engineers and scientists in this space, particularly materials engineers and scientists. Lots of things governments could and should be doing. But if you do all that and then your opponent says, well, what are you doing? Where's your 20, 40, 50 target? And you're like, well, I don't have one because those targets are meaningless. And nobody wants to admit that the emperor has no clothes and that those targets are meaningless. They're just, they don't mean anything. Whereas if you said, you know what, my goal for our government, if I'm an elected official from a party, our government is going to really make a global contribution to getting way better clean energy on the global market. Oh, and by the way, if we do that, we actually might make some money because we could build some companies around that, or we could license technologies, and we can become an exporter. So that's what I think government really has to be focused on. And the big problem is that not all, but many of the environmental groups and activists would start screaming and yelling, and you're a climate denier. One of the things they say now, which drives me crazy, is they'll say, well, this is such a crisis. We don't have time to wait to develop better technology. Well, it's kind of like saying, my health is in crisis because I'm overweight, and so I don't have time to lose weight. Like, well, no, actually, you kind of have only one choice, which is to lose weight. So you can say you don't have time, but it really is meaningless because you're not going to solve the problem the other way. So I think environmentalists also and climate activists, they have to change their whole orientation, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. I mean, they would call people like me, some of them have implied that we're climate denialists. I don't know if you did listen to what I said for the last half hour, how anybody could think that we're denying climate, but that's an easy thing. If you want to tag somebody that you don't like their position, you call them a climate denialist and like denier, and like, not really a good way to have a conversation about a pretty critical problem for the world. Let's have a real conversation.
The big issues like this one, and for instance, in the last couple of podcasts, I've been interviewing very interesting people on artificial intelligence, a topic that nobody's talking about, as you know. But the big issues like this one, artificial intelligence and others, I think they push us to think, let's say I think they drive us to more philosophical questions. And one thing it has come to my mind on several occasions listening to you, and I want to ask what you think, is the following. You mentioned this, very dangerous idea of we don't have time to think of better technologies because the crisis is so terrible. At one point, also the idea of flying, of commercial flying came, and there have been, and recently, I mean, a month ago or so, there was what I would call, and please, I make myself responsible for what I'm going to say, basically an oligarchic article on the Financial Times, basically wanting to rule out mass tourism, which I think is one of the greatest things that have happened to humankind. You also have people who, like the one you mentioned, Greta Thunberg, the high school dropout, who feels betrayed and wants us to live in fear, as the same kind of fear that as she lives, which tells you a lot about her mental state. Do you see let's say at the bottom of this some sort of revolt against civilization as we know it? That, I mean, in a way that we are victims of our own success, that, maybe young people not so long ago at the age of Greta, they were literally have to be thinking about how to procure their next meal, and now that things have been solved. Do you think there is something maybe a little bit more dangerous and a little bit more worrying about the state of our culture that is being channeled by the climate fear?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was remiss in identifying part of what's going on in this debate. One of the big reasons why a lot of environmentalists object or reject my solutions or our solutions is, in my solution, people would still in the US get to live in single-family homes, big single-family homes way out in the suburbs. They'd still get to drive really big cars because they're electric. They'd still get to have a lot of crap. They'd have a boat. They'd have a hot tub. I got a hot tub. I love my hot tub. A lot of the environmental movement rejects consumerism. They think it's immoral that Americans are living. They want us to live in smaller apartments. They basically want us to live like a lot of Parisians live, in smaller apartments. Every day you go out and you buy your baguette and your flowers, and then you come home. In America, we get in our SUV, we drive 10, 20 miles to this big shopping center, we load it up full of stuff. Look, a lot of Americans and people all over the world want to live that way. It's not my job to say that those people are wrong. I live in a single family home, although I ride my bike to work, but I do that not because I'm guilty. I do it because I love riding my bike, and it gives me good exercise. So I think a lot of the environmental movement, the reason they oppose innovation is because if you do innovation right, it lets people live the way they've been living, but it also lets a lot of other people hunt another 5 billion people in the world live like that too, and they don't want that. The other component of that, I wrote an article for a journal called The Independent Review, and it's on their website about a year ago, and it's now open. You can read it now without paying. And it was called The Abandonment of Growth and the Decline of the West. And my argument in that was that what really defined the West from certainly the Industrial Revolution was this faith in growth and progress. We wanted to get richer, and the way to do that was obviously freedom, markets, with the right role of government to support, but we always wanted to get richer. And that started to decay in the West in the late 60s, early 70s. People like John Rawls at Harvard started to say that growth wasn't what we needed equity. And I cite in the book, there are these two academics that actually won a Nobel Prize, and they were writing about India. And they said that, essentially, I might misquote it, but essentially they said, giving people in India more money wouldn't make them any happier. And I was appalled by that. There's actually a really good research now that I cited that instead of asking people once every 6 months, how happy are you? And then saying, what's your income? They ask people, they kind of electronic journaling every 20 minutes, are you happy? Turns out the more money you have, the more satisfied you are. You might not like be happy, like, oh man, I got this great relationship, 1 million friends. I get that. But you're more satisfied. Your life is just better if you have more money. And I don't mean past a certain point, I get it, but that point is pretty high. It's not 100,000. It's more like $1 million, really, when you think about it. It's pretty high. And a lot of these environmentalists and climate people, they actually now literally say with a straight face that we need degrowth, that we should reduce global GDP. And I think that is right to your point, Federico, about sort of something that's a fundamental challenge to who we are in the West. It's a fundamental challenge that changes us. It changes our DNA. If we want to live in a world where there's no more growth and change, in fact, degrowth, that's radical. And I object to that with every fiber of my being. I object to that. I have 2 kids, and if my kids have the same standard of living that we do now, I'm going to be when they're older. I'm going to say the world has failed them. So Greta says failed her. Really, I think your life is so much better than your parents' life at that stage in your life. Just orders of magnitude. Well, that's probably too strong. 50% better than what your parents were doing. And I want my kids' life to be 50% better. And we won't get that without growth. And growth is the thing that makes this possible, because it's not a random fact that richer countries invest more in R&D. They just have that extra surplus, if you will, and they're willing to do it. So more growth actually makes this an easier problem to solve, not a harder problem.
Robert, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talking to you. And I mean, given the amount of excellent material that ITIF produces, I am sure, and I hope this won't be the last time we talk about some of your writings.
That would be great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. And for everyone who listened to this, don't forget to subscribe in any platform you use for podcasts. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we meet again on a new episode of the We Are Innovation podcast.
Thanks for watching this episode of the We Are Innovation podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe. To know more about We Are Innovation, visit weareinnovation.global.